Now, the flotilla, which is hoping to break Israel's genocidal siege of Gaza, the deliberate starvation of the people of Gaza, is en route, disturbing the language being used by the Israeli state about the flotilla, which is very different from last time and is making me worry, to say, about people on the flotilla. One of whom is the ever brilliant David Adler, who's the co-general coordinator of the Progressive International, who kind of do what they say on the tin, really. You can kind of get the gist, can't you, just by saying the title. They kind of bring together lots of movements to advance progressive causes internationally. I think that's reasonable. How are you, David? I can see you there. Whereabouts are you? Can you give us the general gist for geography buffs?
Yeah. So we are a united fleet right now of 40 boats that are traversing the Mediterranean, approaching Crete, where we'll meet up with the last batch of boats that are leaving from Greece. A really critical set of boats because they're going to bring things that allow us to repair the boats that have any mechanical damage and bring additional supplies and set us up for the final leg of the journey as we approach the shores of Gaza. I bring that up, this Greek fleet, because it's important to emphasize that we have no more ports where we can stop. We have no more friendly governments to our north or to our south where we are not at major risk of the kind of bureaucratic sabotage that would basically prevent the realization of this mission. So we cannot dock in Crete, just like we cannot dock in Libya to our south, because there's a real risk that we will never again leave those ports, as we saw in the attempt of the Freedom Flotilla's, one of the largest vessels, attempts to leave Turkey last year. And so morale, I would say, on the boat, Owen, vibrates between two very different registers. On the one, there's a sense of resilience, determination, a feeling of being undeterred, regardless of the logistical, political, technical, geopolitical setbacks that we face, and threats that we confront, and, I'll be honest, a different register, one of genuine fear for our lives as we watch and monitor the escalation of a smear campaign against ourselves, against the initiative, which I'm sure we can get into in greater detail.
But let's talk about that, because I think it is disturbing. Last time, the Israeli state used kind of patronizing kind of language of ridicule, selfie yacht. It was basically, here's a bunch of, self-obsessed celebrities or whatever on a yacht. That was their gist. This time they're talking about this being a Hamas flotilla and being about terrorism. And obviously that's very worrying, because we know how Israel treats civilians who they designate as terrorists. Then tell us about the kind of smear campaign and the, without, it's a worrying thing to talk about. But yeah, let's just talk about the implications, like your fears.
Yeah, so there were always these two competing narratives, two incompatible narratives from which Israel has had to choose. In the past, in previous efforts that have been led by the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, they've also gone with the latter narrative that you described there. Terror links, Hamas links, threats to national security. It was only more recently with the Madleen, with the Hamdallah, that they chose to go with this pleasure cruise, indulgence of celebrity status, people taking selfies on a yacht. This particular initiative puts them in a very difficult position for two reasons. On the one side, it's unprecedented proportions. This global summer flotilla is larger than the sum of all previous missions that have ever set sail to reach the shores of Gaza to deliver tons of humanitarian aid. So they're in a tough position because of that, and because of the fact that 16 states just last week, among them Slovenia and Spain and Ireland, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, have come out not only in recognition of this initiative as a humanitarian mission, but of the international humanitarian laws that corresponds to our lives and the security of the boats. But there's an additional factor, Owen, that I think is relevant to bring up, which speaks to our identities. I mean, I'm looking across the boat here that is composed of family boat, the lead vessel of the entire fleet, and it's got a French actress who loves to beat me at chess whenever we have a free moment. We have Bianca, a family physician from Australia. We've got Ada Colau, former mayor of Barcelona. And we've got a Jewish American young guy like me from California who is evidently motivated by the same thing that's motivating a lot of Jews of our generation in Britain and the United States to speak out about the genocide in Gaza, which is that we refuse to let these crimes against humanity be committed in our names, and we need to recover our identity and our tradition and our history from a national or settler colonial project that seeks to monopolize and distort and pervert those same symbols. So those kinds of personalities and people, personnel, the participants of this global summit flotilla, this throws a kind of wrench into that. So even as Israel is escalating this campaign, every day we're seeing from the foreign ministry, from the main kind of, at Israel accounts, we're seeing more and more of this propaganda, which, as you say, is predictive of Israeli behavior in general. But even for our participants on our boats, people like Greta, who's traveling alongside of us, they can't tell whether to say that we're just useful idiots or we're actually complicit, harboring, and somehow in a kind of malicious way connected to terror organizations that menace the security of the state of Israel.
I mean, some people watching will think, surely they couldn't be that insane, given lots of people with quote unquote Western privilege, with, high profile politicians, celebrities, all the rest of it. I guess the worry is people would look at particularly the last 2 years, not exclusively, and think, well, they've kind of got away with everything. So is that the worry? It's kind of this. People think to themselves, well, it's one thing exterminating Palestinians who are completely and utterly dehumanized. Actually, the Israel bombed a vehicle in Lebanon 2 days ago and killed several people with US citizenship. I just would obviously know that. Sorry, this is grim to talk about. What do you think, though? Because part of me just, it would be, do you think they could actually be that insane on their own terms?
I think that the state of Israel is really caught in a centrifugal dynamic that is whipping its political economic system towards an increasingly radicalized and extremist right. And in that whipping, in that fast motion centrifuge, the forces of friction that would put a halt to that have all but disappeared. I celebrate the courage of those who are mobilizing, either not to join the Israeli Defense Forces or to leave the country or to speak up and speak out against crimes committed by their government, by the Netanyahu government. But as far as we can tell, there have been no serious limits or boundaries put on the behavior of the state of Israel, the case that you mentioned. In just the day that we were docked in the port of Sidi Bou Said, when 2 drone attacks in successive midnight attacks came to this boat and to the other lead vessel, the Alma. On that same day, Israel bombed Doha in Qatar. They bombed Lebanon, southern Lebanon. They bombed Syria, and they bombed Yemen. So 5 sovereign nations suffered unilateral, coercive, and lethal force at the hands of the state, and there were no consequences whatsoever. So in that sense, Owen, we're preparing for every single scenario. One scenario, and we sustain, we maintain, and we try to keep alive this sense of hope and determination. One scenario is we reach the shores of Gaza. We are 40 boats, and Israel has never had to deal with a fleet this large and this determined to sail onward and to deliver this humanitarian aid, and above all, to establish a corridor, a sea corridor, when the land ports at places like Rafah have been closed for so long and so determinedly by the state of Israel and its military. But we're practicing for other scenarios and doing drills for other scenarios. One is a violent interception. We practice every day, standing, hands up, nonviolent, pacifist approaches to what may happen in a case of a violent interception. And now we're preparing for a third scenario, which could be a blockade of some kind, sea mines, some way of basically trying to have a standoff with the flotilla at sea, which would be, unbelievably criminal under any interpretation of international law, but would effectively try to stop us before we're ever even close enough to engage in that kind of confrontation that could risk life and livelihood, that could put Israel in a tough position with, as you say, the detention and eventual deportation, perhaps long-term incarceration of many of the high-profile, more visible, and as you say, sort of passport-privileged participants of the global solar flotilla.
This also underlines, doesn't it, that the siege of Gaza if there was the will, could just be broken. I mean, there's one thing that, look, they could just, for example, the EU could just impose sweeping sanctions and cripple Israel's economy, given they're the biggest trading partner, and demand that they open the land borders. That's one thing. But actually, countries could just send a massive fleet to Gaza. And,
well, let's Israel, let's not forget that this was done. So you may recall the mega $1 million fracasso that was Biden's sea bridge, right?
Yeah.
So it's not as I think one thing that is so devastating, demoralizing, but deeply, deeply shocking to the conscience of the people on this boat. It's such a long journey across the Mediterranean, but we're crossing through parts of the Mediterranean that are frequently celebrated as vacation destinations, right? We left from Barcelona, we passed through Sicily, we're on our way to Crete, right? We're crossing through these places that are considered, but this is the very same sea from which Gazans are restricted, that is heavily militarized, where the siege is being enforced. So the siege is illegal, as I said, by any interpretation. Ask any international lawyer. There's no way that Israel can sustain this legally. And what's astounding is that even when we were able to get the support of 16 states to say we protect this flotilla, not one of them has come and said, "Oh, you know what? And even if it's coming up the rear, we're going to have our Navy or our protective forces or state-based kind of humanitarian development agencies travel alongside you with a much bigger vessel that could carry much more humanitarian aid to participate in this great opening of a humanitarian corridor." So I think that we're trying to put a really heavy emphasis on this corridor aspect of the mission rather than just sort of like a drop of aid and then everyone goes home, because it's an infrastructure. It sets up a demand that we want to make to states friendly and adversarial, to say, if the peoples of the world are prepared to put their lives in the line to set up this infrastructure, to establish that corridor, then fine, we're prepared to do it. But then you should be prepared to have our backs and come quickly behind us with those ships that can actually correspond to the severity and the urgency of the genocide in Gaza.
And this is, what's important at the moment as well is for people to keep talking about Gaza, because obviously Israel has lots of different strategies, lying, muddying the waters, deflection, but it's also making sure that people don't talk about what's happening to the people of Gaza because of their genocide. And that is, the media coverage is dire, but there's been much less coverage, partly because so many Palestinian journalists have been murdered alongside their entire families. So we just have less people reporting from Gaza anyway, including in our social media feeds. There's a horrible, grim reality to have to spell out. But we need to have focus, don't we? And this is what Flotilla is doing, that people in Gaza are suffering a heinous crime.
But it's a double focus. So one is, of course, as we were saying, it's keeping all eyes on Gaza and this humanitarian crisis. It's using this direct action to reveal a structure of violence, to reveal that spiraling dynamic of violence that has Israel retaliate violently against anyone who seeks to position a moral argument, a moral stance against their deeply putrid, immoral, that political dynamic that I was describing before. But equally, Owen, and very importantly, and the reason why we put so much emphasis on these 44 national delegations, this flotilla is also about shining a light on the state obligations that correspond to the member states of the United Nations that are together gathered right now at the UN in New York City for the General Assembly. So just this week, of course, we have the French-Saudi, pat ourselves in the back recognition of the state of Palestine. And our message from the flotilla has been very simple, that the recognition of the state of Palestine will remain mere empty rhetoric without concrete measures to halt the extermination of its people, the destruction of their communities, and the annexation of their land. What are we really talking about? Many people have pointed this out on social media, that the state of Palestine, or the territories of Palestine that are now published as formally recognized by the government of Keir Starmer, for example, are these Bantustan, fragmented and, apartheid governed minor territories. So I think that, part of this, of course, is a direct confrontation with Israel, but just as important, as we're seeing in the massive strikes that overwhelmed Italy and ports, trains, and highways yesterday, we're trying to link the mobilization at sea to the mobilization on land, to be a lightning rod for a sustained mobilization on land. If, as bridge characters and as participants of this flotilla, we can be helpful in drawing our respective communities, journalists and lawyers and doctors and I guess what am I? Political operatives, whatever we are, in drawing our respective geographic and professional communities into this struggle and directing their attention more emphatically and more concentratedly to the issue of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Fantastic. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is basically reveal the hollow nature of the condemnations and declarations and signatures and statements that have been emitted from the highest annals of diplomatic power without any serious and substantial intervention at the level of life and livelihood in Gaza.
I mean, that was the final point I was just going to put to you, really, because I've just come back from Palestine. It's actually why I couldn't join you on the flotilla. That was a pretty good excuse, to be fair. But what was impressed upon me by Palestinians was that recognition was, well, in any case, 30 years too late, that it was being done for domestic political consumption in Britain to show people that something was being done as a substitute for taking effective action to actually stop the genocide. And obviously Palestinians kept asking, what is there to be left of Palestine to even recognize?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we shouldn't let these representatives of ours pretend as if this is somehow a hypothetical question, or that we don't have the tools within reach to address and to halt and detain this genocide, or at minimum to isolate and to sanction and to take the kind of necessary measures that could put Israel in a more difficult diplomatic position. And we're seeing those being taken by governments that are organized, for example, in the Hague Group, that is committed to moving from words to action. And what are some of those measures? Well, one of them is a review of all public contracts to make sure that governments are not sourcing technologies or parts in either direction, import or export, with Israeli companies. It's not using ports, so basically respecting the arms trade treaty. So making sure that ports and airports are not being used as they have been used repeatedly in the United Kingdom to transport lethal weaponry or any kind of ammunition, from bullet casings all the way to chemicals that could be deployed against the Palestinian people. And it's, of course, engaging in commercial transformations and rewriting of commercial ties, such as the EU-Israel trade agreement. Many countries have bilateral trade agreements that need to be urgently renegotiated, just even to gain leverage at a geopolitical level. So I think it's really important not to be distracted by this kind of smokescreen recognition when there are tools on the table that many countries are using, Colombia and South Africa, Malaysia and Indonesia, that are using to try to at least set the precondition for a more serious response to the genocide in Gaza. No one thinks that kicking Israel out of UEFA or Eurovision is going to end the genocide. But we do think that stripping away the ties of complicity is a precondition for a more honest dialogue or more honest peace process that can allow Palestinians to set the terms of their self-determination. And this is not like a abstract or like a Marxian kind of point. What I'm trying to make it's very simple. If Israel runs the technology in your hospitals or in your planes or in your or in Whitehall, like if you're beholden in a structural and technological level to the state of Israel, how are you in good faith going to engage in these kinds of negotiations? So I think we need to be clear-eyed about setting up those preconditions, even before we can have a more ambitious discussion, which of course we shouldn't lead and shouldn't even take part in. It should be led, of course, by Palestinians defending their ancestral territories. But all we can really do is make revolution in our own countries, so to speak. This is so far from revolution. Make important reforms in our own countries to try to reduce the degree of structural dependency on Israel and, of course, on the United States that's backing it, in order to at least have a sovereign and more democratic conversation about the kinds of relationships that our countries want to have at the geopolitical level.
Amen. And, of course, I mean, if we look back at the struggle against apartheid, it wasn't, this one band boycotted and South Africa and the whole thing collapsed. It was the combination of lots of different actions together, collective action, collective struggle, and the sum of all the parts, which both within South Africa and externally to South Africa brought down apartheid. And obviously the same will happen again. But honestly, David, it's such such a privilege to speak to you. I am worried about you. I'm worried about all of you. And I know everyone listening and watching will share that anxiety and be wishing you all well. It's so important what you're doing. And we'll be anxiously scrolling through Twitter and all the other social media platforms to check up on you. Share the video, everyone. Press like and subscribe. Leave your comments. Engagement, obviously, very important, so people can listen. But to you, David, thank you so much as ever for your brilliant work.
Speak to you soon, Noah. Thanks so much for the chance to speak.
Cheers, buddy.